and gentlemen, زملائنا في الأنكتاد ومنظمة التعاون والتنمية الاقتصادية، السيدات والسادة المشاركين والمشاركات الكرام, I would like to welcome you all to our joint competition law and policy webinar hosted by UNESCWA in collaboration with the OECD and UNCTAD. I am pleased to see so many participants from all around the world with us today. We will discuss a very important and up-to-date topic today, the complex challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on competition policy, and share with you the experiences from around the world and the Arab region on best practices to mitigate this adverse impact. It is of no doubt that the crisis illustrated the importance of competition policy for governments to build more resilient economies. Before we start with today's webinar and give the floor to our speakers, I would like to inform you about some logistical matters. First of all, translation from English to Arabic will be available throughout the webinar. You will be able to see the translation in the live chat box. If any question occurred during the webinar that you would like our speakers to address, you can still submit these questions through the registration form. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all questions in the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. If your question was not answered, we will reach out to you by email with an answer from our speakers. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to UNESCWA's Deputy Executive Secretary, Mr. Munir Thabit, to give the introductory remarks. Mr. Thabit, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum jami'an, sabah al-khair. Excellencies, colleagues from UNCTAD, OECD, League of Arab States, and other participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to welcome you to this joint UNESCWA UNCTAD OECD webinar on competition in the Arab region at the virtual United Nations House in Beirut. Of course, we would have preferred to have you all here with us physically and interact with you face-to-face and in person. But as we all know, COVID has forced us, as has everyone else, to change the format of our meetings. I would like to thank you all for your notable commitment and participation. While the formats of our meetings have changed, it is natural to ask if the content has also changed. Is COVID-19 imposing on us new thinking, new approaches, new business models? What we know for sure is that the post-COVID will not be like pre-COVID. A new normal is emerging. Supply chains have been disrupted, social distancing, confinement, and urgent attention to medical issues have had an unexpected and unprecedented socioeconomic consequences. Entire sectors have been shaken to the core. Tourism, entertainment, even industrial production that require close proximity of workers. And thousands of businesses, particularly small medium enterprises, have shut down. Many never to reopen again. Governments have been responding. Some with stimulus packages, others with direct support, and others with limited their support, and their stimulus packages have been limited to health measures, particularly those whose fiscal space is too tight to allow them greater measures. Many of these measures have been protectionists, and they have protectionist flavors to them, focusing on food security, on strengthening national production, on protecting population within national borders. We are not out of the woods yet. We are still in the middle of the crisis, and we are at the beginning of the road to the new normal. Yet, as we all know, the flip side of every crisis is an opportunity. So what opportunity do all of these disruptions present? What new global and economic models will emerge? And what opportunities do we have to influence them? All across the world, think tanks, governments, UN agencies, and others are thinking and planning for this new model. Today, here, we have a chance to make our own modest contribution. We have held the premise that competition and consumer protection are a positive force. Will this premise hold in front of potential stronger protectionist practices? These are beginning to emerge. We in the UN, and I'm sure this is the case for many institutions, believe that Agenda 2030 and its Sustainable Development Goals continue to be the roadmap that would guide our reflections on the new norm. Its commitment to equality, inclusion, and sustainability, its people-focused approach, and commitment to the planet's environment leave a key role for prosperity and growth. For without growth, there can be no prosperity. Yet, the same agenda, long before COVID, called on all of us to revisit our consumption and production patterns, SDG 12, for those of you who do that. So today, we discuss our own take on competition. We might do well in keeping in mind the Agenda 2030 and its commitment to equality, inclusion, and sustainability, and to reflect how does competition contribute to the emerging production and consumption patterns. What policy measures can governments consider? What changing role for the private sector? What new players will emerge? What new technologies will be developed, and how will they influence these patterns? Much is unknown. That is good. Thank you. That's one of the challenges of technologies. So what new players will emerge? What new technologies will be developed? And how will they influence these new emerging patterns, consumption and production patterns? Much is unknown. And that's probably a good thing, as it gives us a chance to influence the outcome. It is my hope that the deliberations today will be one positive contribution to shaping the outcome in line with the principles of the Agenda 2030. I understand that today's webinar will provide an opportunity for Arab competition authorities to share the experiences they have had since the beginning of the crisis, the obstacles they have faced, the measures they have taken to protect competition in their countries. The webinar allows them to exchange information and to learn from best practices. Additionally, experts from the League of Arab States, OECD, UNCTAD, and UNESCWA will discuss the importance of regional and international cooperation in these times and illustrate how regional and international organizations can support competition authorities in adjusting to the new challenges. Allow me to close by underscoring the importance we place on our partnerships with UNCTAD, the OECD, with the League of Arab States, with other partners in this endeavor. We have a collective responsibility, and we will do our best to ensure that our response is also corrected. I thank you for your participation and wish you a very successful meeting. I thank you for your attention, and I will pass the floor to my colleague Natalie Khalid, but I will ask for your forgiveness if I have to leave in a few minutes, as I'm sure you understand I have other engagements that I must attend to. The very best of luck for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thabit, for this introduction, which actually has set the pace for our discussions today. We might begin, please, now with our first panel. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected every country in the world and had a significant impact on competition in the market. In our first panel today, we will hear from international experts about the main challenges on competition and law faced by authorities around the world since the beginning of the crisis, and what were the best measures in response they have taken to mitigate the impact on competition. I now pass the floor to our first speaker of the day, Professor Frédéric Jenny, who is the chairman of the OECD Competition Committee. Professor Jenny, what are the main challenges faced by competition authorities around the world and best measures taken to protect and promote competition since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic? You have 10 minutes, please, to elaborate.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you very much to UNESCWA to join forces with OECD and UNCTAD to organize this very interesting seminar. So you asked a very large question. What are the challenges that we're facing? Let me start with a very simple point, which is the origin of the discussion is the pandemic. And the pandemic is a challenge for us in two ways. First, what it created was a huge demand for some goods, vaccines, respirators, drugs, etc. At the same time, to try to fight the pandemic, there was a lockdown in many countries, which completely disrupted the supply on many markets. So we had huge spike of demand and a collapse of supply. So all of a sudden, whereas we are used to think of markets as places where the price mechanism adjusts supply and demand, we were faced with a breakdown of this mechanism. And whereas usually we're interested in making sure that the price is at the competitive level rather than at the monopolistic level, that question became a little moot when supply and demand couldn't meet for the reasons which I have explained. Now, I have some slides, so if you can show the slides, I would want to first say that this has created, I think, for competition authorities, four types of challenges. Next slide. First, a challenge about the scope of competition law and the role that competition authorities could play in advocacy. Second, a challenge of enforcement. How should we adjust enforcement of competition law given what I have just described in the different dimensions of competition law enforcement, which is pricing abuse, horizontal cooperation, and mergers principally. Third, there is a challenge of making competition law consistent with other policy actions which have an impact on competition, whether it's industry rescue packages, foreign investment restrictions, government procurement measures, or government interventions, sometimes directly on competition agencies. And finally, there is a challenge that we are going to face in the future once we get out of the crisis, which is what is the lasting impact of the crisis on industrial structures, on market structures, and how is competition law going to evolve in a period which is going to be a period of recession. So let me give a few examples of this. Go to the next slide. No, the third slide. The first dimension is the dimension of exemptions from competition law or suspension of competition law. In a number of countries, we've seen that the government has either suspended competition law entirely or is thinking even now about doing it, or has suspended competition law in some sectors. Example, South Africa took block exemptions to take the healthcare sector outside of the scope of competition law, as well as the banking and the real estate market. In Australia, we have a different system where it is not the government, but it is the competition authority, which can, when it thinks that a particular sector should be exempted from competition law, decide that there is going to be an exemption to this activity. And here we have examples in Australia, in the UK, and in New Zealand, for example. So first question, why should we want to exempt some sectors from competition law? Well, sometimes the severity of the disruption is such that to try to re-establish supply and demand, there is a need for government intervention, which is quite different from competition law. Now, of course, next slide, competition authority have a big role to play there in trying to make sure that the government doesn't go too far in exempting or in creating regulations for sectors, does not unduly suppress competition, and to help the government separate what is justified from unjustified intervention. There's also a challenge for competition authorities to advise businesses of how the enforcement of competition law is going to change and what that means in terms of what is going to be prohibited and what is not going to be prohibited. And we've seen that in many countries, the competition authorities have published guidance to businesses to tell them what some of the new rules of the games were. So let me go now from competition advocacy to substance and different types of substance. And if you go to the next slide, the first issue which competition authorities were faced with was excessive prices or price gouging in all the markets where there was an increase, considerable increase in demand, and where supply was inelastic or in some places were collapsing. And the response of competition authority has been quite different on those grounds. In some jurisdictions, like the US, there is the notion that competition law should not intervene on prices. In other jurisdictions, like the EU, there is much more tolerance for the fact that an abuse of dominance can be a pricing abuse, and that therefore there is a legitimate way for competition authority to intervene. And finally, in some jurisdictions, the competition law has been modified to facilitate the possibility for competition authorities to intervene against prices. A good example of this would be South Africa, which declared that during the national disaster period, any indication that prices went up faster than cost, and that therefore the price-cost margin was increasing, was a prima facie indication that there was a competition violation. So we see different types of answer. In general, the answers depend on whether there is a public interest goal in the competition law, like in the UK, whether the competition authorities see that intervention on excessive prices are legitimate or not, and there's a big difference, as I explained, between US and EU, whether the competition authority has several functions, not only competition authority, but also consumer protection, because in that case, the competition authority can use its consumer protection function. This would be the case of the CMA in the UK, for example. And finally, the provisions of the law, as I explained, in some countries, the law allows an easier possibility for the competition authority to intervene. So we saw differences with different levels. Some countries, the competition authority only does monitoring of prices. Some other countries, the competition authorities issues warning. And finally, some countries, the competition authorities directly intervene. Let me next move to horizontal agreements. Well, traditionally, competition authorities do not like competitors to get together and to enter into horizontal agreements. But we have two specific dimensions of cooperation in the context of the crisis that one should keep in mind. The first one is that we have discovered that because of the disruption of the supply line, sometimes competitors could get together to increase or restore supply rather than to suppress supply. Now, traditionally, cartels try to limit supply to increase prices. Well, we are in circumstances where competitors sometimes have to come together to try to make sure that there's enough which is going to be produced and which is going to be fairly distributed among the retailers or among the people. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we have this disruption on markets, one of the consequences, at least for a number of markets, is a development of the pandemics. If we don't have enough masks to go around, if we don't have enough respirators, if we don't have vaccines, it means that the pandemics continues. People get sick, some people die, and there is a huge cost on the economic activity. So there is a slightly different perspective on horizontal cooperation in a case of pandemic than there is in normally functioning markets. So next slide. We have seen that a lot of competition authorities have allowed some kind of cooperation among firms to try to restore supply or to try to allocate supply when there was a great scarcity. Unlike what was traditionally the case. And some arrangements, which would have been considered anti-competitive in normal times, are considered to have the positive effect of trying to increase supply. And this has been published, for example, by the Commission in a communication on the establishment of a temporary framework for assessing antitrust issues related to measures taken to adapt production, stock management, and distribution. And this allows some kind of cooperation, which in normal times would not be acceptable, but is acceptable in those troubled times under a number of conditions. First, that the object of the agreement is to increase output. Second, that the agreement is temporary. And third, that it is limited to what is strictly necessary to get the increase in supply. Now, if you look at the FTC DOJ statement in the US, you see pretty much the same thing. We are not going to go, I mean, that's what the competition authority says. We're not going to go against competition against agreements because of the exigent circumstances, and we are going to take on board similar considerations. Okay, next. The next challenge is failing mergers and the failing firm defense. A lot of firms are going to go bankrupt. Some of those firms will be tempted to merge with others because they will not be, there will be overcapacity for one thing, and second, there will be much reduced supply. Traditionally, competition authorities have been very resistant to allowing anti-competitive mergers on the basis of the failing firm defense, which says that if the acquired asset is a failing firm, well, then there is not much reduction in competition and the merger should be allowed. But competition authorities have been very strict on the conditions and the standard of proof. In the case of the failing firm defense, the parties have to show that the failing firm would be forced out and that its asset would leave the industry, that there is no less anti-competitive alternative for the merger, and the assets of the merging firm would leave the market, as I said. The question which is raised, in a time of economic depression, when there are a lot of firms going under and going bankrupt, should we relax not the criteria, but the standard of proof that the firms have to meet to allow the efficiency defense? And there is an interesting discussion which has been taking place because you don't assess a merger in a market which is collapsing the same way that you would assess this merger when the market is expanding. Next slide. We also have a challenge coming from what government does outside of competition policy, but which has an impact on competition. State aid is a very good example. First of all, because all the countries do not have the same means to give state aid to firms that are facing a liquidity crisis or that are failing or that are having huge losses in the short run. And second, because it's very easy by granting state aid to, in fact, disrupt competition by favoring some firms to the detriment of others. So their competition authorities have a huge role to play to try to tell the government, if you're going to give state aid, you must give state aid or help in a way which is not going to distort competition. Second, there is a question raised in many countries. A lot of our firms are failing because of the economic situation. Some foreign firms are going to try to take over, or strategic firms, which are very cheap today, and possibly state aid firms that are aided by states in other countries are going to take the opportunity to buy or crown jewels or strategic firms. Should we have a screening of foreign investment that would restrict the ability of foreign firm to invest in our firms when we think that our strategic interest is at play? Now, this is, to the extent that it happens, this is going to restrict competition. So there's a fine line between trying to protect your strategic interest and not overtly reducing competition or abusively reducing competition. Revision of public procurement rules. Public procurement is quite important, particularly in a time of depression when private demand is reducing. Some governments are tempted to take a position saying, well, I want to favor my domestic firms. And we've seen this already happen after the 2008 crisis. I'm willing to give state aid, but I want to make sure that this state aid doesn't benefit some foreign country. And therefore, I want to protect my public procurement and facilitate the bidding of domestic firms. Again, this is something which may reduce competition and where competition authorities should intervene to try to say, don't go too far, don't abusively reduce competition. So this is all I wanted to say. What we see are two things: an adjustment of competition law, slight adjustment. We're not changing the principles, but the reality of the enforcement changes a little bit because the environment changes. Second, there's a rise in thoughts about industrial policy, protectionism, etc., which are a threat to competition and where competition authority can advocate against going too far and against restricting abusively competition on markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very insightful intervention. Now, without further ado, I would like to pose the same question to our second speaker for today, Ms. Teresa Moreira. Ms. Moreira is the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch at UNCTAD. Ms. Teresa, the floor is now yours for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just trying to share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with colleagues from UNESCWA and, of course, from OECD. And I would like to greet all the participants. I have to say that it is very, as usual, very difficult to talk about after Frederick Jenny, who just covered, I think, everything I could say, but let me try to present this in a slightly different manner. So I would like to start by saying that undoubtedly the COVID-19 crisis disrupted markets and people's and citizens' lives all over the world. And unfortunately, as we know, this is far from being over. And I would like to highlight that because of the devastating impact of the pandemic, of course, governments, so member states of, well, in this case of UNCTAD, were keen and were poised to take action, to take measures to tackle as best as possible the negative consequences of the pandemic. This means to say that already since, I would say, mid-March, at least in Europe, but of course still spreading all over the world afterwards, what we have seen is very strong government intervention, as mentioned earlier, that is oriented to the achievement of public goals by public interest. And even though this is quite understandable and legitimate and important, I do believe that competition authorities need to assert themselves and be actively involved in all discussions regarding the design and the drafting of legislation, of sector-specific measures, and on the implementation of these measures in order to make sure that markets will remain open and fair, and especially to prepare this transition that we are all waiting for the real post-COVID-19 crisis. So as Fred Jenny mentioned, UNCTAD has been gathering information from all over the world with our 195 members. Of course, this has allowed us to note that not only developed countries, but several developing countries have been extremely active adopting measures to face the negative impact of the pandemic. And as mentioned already, I think we can say that there were 4 major issues where we saw an action and reaction from competition authorities across the world. The enforcement related actions that were already mentioned, I would like in any case to underline that in a number of jurisdictions, action against price increases, so price gouging, for instance, and other abusive business practices were actually sanctioned within or under consumer protection legislation, or just under general economic legislation that forbids speculations, for instance. Of course, this was a major concern due to the high prices of not only consumer food products, but also key health products such as masks and hand sanitizers. At the same time, I do believe that it is extremely important that competition authorities remain very vigilant market monitoring the evolution of markets, and also interacting with businesses and business representatives through these warning letters and through the recommendations and guidance that encourage compliance all over the world. I do believe this dual approach is extremely important in normal times, and of course in these very disruptive times this was probably important more than ever. I also would like to mention that due to the effect of the pandemic, competition authorities were occasionally asked to be more flexible in the application of deadlines for submissions and for the presentation of documents within merger control. So, of course, especially I would say in the first 2 months, there were colleagues from all over the world asking us what were the experiences of the suspension of deadlines, or even an exceptional suspension of proceedings due to the disruptiveness caused by the fact that everybody was quarantined. Well, Fred has already mentioned exemptions. I think it is quite interesting that for maybe the first time we saw across the world a very quick reply to authorize horizontal agreement between competitors for a public interest objective, just to maintain, for instance, regular supply. This happened between supermarkets and other retail areas. Of course, research and development on everything that regards the fight against the pandemic. So trying for new vaccines, for new pharmaceuticals, for the adjustment of medical equipment, so the ventilators, the respirators that were already mentioned, were also extremely important. But it is interesting again to say that countries like South Africa, Brazil, Kenya, China were so not only the developed countries where the most experienced competition authorities, of course, have established themselves and are maybe a better resourced and in a way were maybe better placed to react to the crisis. But we saw again in Latin America, in the African continent, in Asia, competition authorities being keen and poised to react very quickly to the new situation that was faced. I also wanted to mention again the merger control that was already touched upon by Fred. I think, well, it's not so much what we have observed until now, but what we can or what we are now starting to observe that it is relevant. Because as you know, in a number of countries, I would just refer to the European Union, but I'm sure this applies not only to other OECD countries, but of course also to developing countries and countries with economies in transition. The fact that the layoff conditions, so let's say employment being in a way subsidized by governments to a huge package of funds is being extended at least until October, is probably also postponing a number of mergers that will take place due to the bankruptcy of small firms and also to the eagerness of some big market players to conquer market shares, and therefore I think merger control and market concentration, especially in the areas, the sectors that are undergoing the worst impact, such as tourism, such as retail, such as air transport, such as the automobile, such as was mentioned earlier, cultural activities, namely entertainment related, and of course, everything that concerns the digital economy will need to be very closely monitored by competition authorities in order to make sure that the economic recovery does not provide an excuse for abusive market concentration and abuses of market power. My final point here is advocacy, as Fred Jenny already mentioned. Just to say that I do think that I left it to the end because I think this is the most relevant activity or role for competition authorities in the months to come and probably still in the following years. Why? Because governments took a very strong intervention as was expected and as is legitimate. And so even in the most developed countries in the world, see in the European Union, we have been observing these huge economic recovery packages that we usually entitle state aid packages, not only sector specific, but also SMEs driven in order to make sure that businesses get back to normal functioning as much as possible and that employment is maintained. Now, it is extremely important that competition authorities are, as I said in the beginning, very closely involved in order to make sure that they advocate for a pro-competitive approach and that this is concretely translated into commitments, into conditions imposed to the sectors or to the targeted companies for a fair and healthy competition in the markets. I think this is still something that we need to be observing in the near future. But I do believe that this is the most important role, and I think it is a very interesting role because, as you can imagine, UNCTAD has 195 members. So our counterparts are government representatives. So I do think that UNCTAD is very well placed to actually also reach out to governments and recommend them strongly to interact with their competition authorities. So this is a time for, as we heard in the beginning, our colleague from UNESCWA saying the collective responsibility underlines the global nature of this pandemic and of its consequences. And there is a very strong need for cooperation and for collaboration. I just wanted to draw your attention also to the fact that UNCTAD did release news items on these issues, gathering information. We do believe that sharing information and even suggesting measures encouraged cooperation between neighbor jurisdictions, but also between less experienced competition authorities in this case and more experienced competition authorities. And we do believe that this provided suggestions, even a source of inspiration on how to better deal with the pandemic. I'm getting to the end. I wanted to draw your attention, as you can imagine, to the fact that this year we were having our 8th UN Review Conference on Competition and Consumer Protection. The UN set of competition principles and rules celebrates this year its 40th anniversary, and it remains extremely important. We expect the conference, among other issues, to adopt the guiding policies and procedures under Section F that is devoted to international cooperation of the UNCTAD to facilitate enforcement cooperation in competition law between jurisdictions and between competition authorities across the world. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we will also discuss strengthening consumer protection and competition in a digital economy, combating cross-border cartels, competitive neutrality, and of course the implementation of the set and technical assistance and capacity building. Even though these topics were agreed upon last July, I do believe they remain extremely relevant in the current context. And so we expect to have in-person sessions combined with remote attendance, but we look forward to having you there. My final remarks are just a sum up of some of the things I just said. I would like to underline that because UNCTAD has a double mandate, so competition and consumer protection, we actually saw a very strong and assertive response from consumer protection agencies immediately after the price gouging and the misleading advertising and quite a lot of online fraud and abusive behaviors by digital players. And it was very interesting to see that there is still a huge potential of collaboration between competition authorities and consumer protection agencies. Of course, in some cases, like the Consumers and Markets Authority of the UK or the Australian CCC or even the US Federal Trade Commission, that combine both responsibilities, but you don't really need to have both mandates under the same agency to improve cooperation. And I do believe that also working closer with sector regulators, with procurement authorities, and with data procurement authorities, I think this is becoming increasingly important, and I would like to draw your attention to that. Again, advocacy. I would especially call on competition authorities also to follow closely the implementation and the market functioning of these companies and of the sector of activities that are going to be funded through subsidies, through loans, through state guarantees. So it is extremely important because unfortunately, the economic recovery is going to take some time. So we run the risk of having the next 2.5 years still undergoing this transitional phase. which can then really lead to a serious restriction of competition in several key markets. Also, of course, continuing market monitoring, keeping a vigorous law enforcement, again, key attention on digital platforms behaviors, because as we know right now, we are so much dependent on these new digital tools that this is also providing them a very good opportunity to grow and in a way get maybe too big, too dominant, and to restrict competition. A final word on the importance of international cooperation. I do believe in regional cooperation, and because here we have the Arab countries, even though of course UNESCWA member states also are spread across several regions, I do think this is extremely important. The transnational nature of the pandemic unfortunately led to different, dispersed, divergent even national reactions, but it is true that this really requires increased cross-border cooperation. And again, UNCTAD, I believe, is very well placed to facilitate discussions in cooperation with UNESCWA, with the OECD, and with other partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Teresa. We will also elaborate more on the role of regional and international organizations and cooperation more in our panel 3. Now, moving to our second panel, we now continue to hear from the national perspective of 4 competition authorities from the different Arab sub-regions. We are delighted that we have expert delegations from Egypt, Palestine, Kuwait, and Tunisia with us today. Countries from the region will share their experiences regarding the challenges they faced since the beginning of the pandemic and the measures to protect and promote competition in their countries. Examples of such measures, and as our speakers had said, include, for example, reactions to cases of price gouging, abuses of dominance, merger control, relaxation of competition laws, and cooperation with other authorities. I now pass the floor to Dr. Amir Nabil, who is the chairman of the Egyptian Competition Authority. Dr. Nabil, what have been the main challenges you have faced in Egypt since the beginning of the crisis? And what measures have you taken to protect and promote competition? You have 10 minutes, please, to present your case.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for the UNESCWA and the OECD and the UNCTAD for joining forces in organizing this webinar and allowing us to share our experience. It's always hard, as Teresa said, to speak after Professor Frederic and after Teresa herself. But I think what we have achieved in the last couple of months is not very different from what have been discussed, and therefore I would be exploring it very quickly. As said, the COVID-19 pandemic has considerably affected. I think let me share our presentation with you first, so that it can be better reflected. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the presentation, please?
We can't, Doctor.
Just give me a second, please.
Yes.
Okay, can you see it now? I think we are having a difficulty in sharing our presentation, so I will just continue my speech until...
Would you like us, Dr. Nabil, to share it on your behalf, and then you can...
Yes, please.
Okay.
I think, yes, please, if you can do that.
Yes.
No. I think this is my speech. This is not a presentation. This is Frederick Jenny.
هو لازم نعمل شيء ما اعرفش هم دي باش هنقول ولا
I think, Lael, we need a permission from the UNESCWA to share our screen, which we don't have.
Can you try now, please, Dr. Nabil? Can you please try, because we're having also trouble.
I'm trying.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, very good. So as I was saying, the pandemic has considerably affected not just Egypt, but the entire Arab region almost since the beginning of 2020. As such, addressing the complex interplay between competition policy and the strategic challenges posed by the crisis is an important task for any competition authorities. And an example for these strategic challenges could be the shortage in the essential goods and services, the exit of small firms from the market, the increased barriers to entry due to importation restriction, and reduced access to essential facilities, for instance, although also reduced ability to expand for stronger incumbent, which may ultimately lead to reduced FDI and increased unemployment. But how each of these challenges is actually translated in the economy? What we have seen is that in the Arab region economies, there is a striking contrast between a formal and informal economy. The latter is directly linked to limited social protection and unstable revenues. Informal workers are generally concentrated in low productivity jobs, rendering them more vulnerable in time of crisis, given the low possibility of working remotely. Given the pandemic and associated confinement measure, there is immense pressure on informal workers to choose between complying with government-imposed health measure or maintaining an income. More often than not, it has led to substantial layoffs. There is also demand shocks and supply chain obstruction. The pandemic has caused disruption in most supply chain and led to shortage in several key products such as essential medication, disinfectants, surgical masks, with many producers cutting production capacity utilization given lower demand on non-essential goods. Also, the impact of the pandemic is more pronounced in the health system. The low health system expenditure and human resources shortages may render a specific health system unable to accommodate growing cases of infection. And as such, the Egyptian Competition Authority believes that its role becomes vital in making sure that the risks of abuses by large private hospital chains does not pose significant risk on consumer welfare. In relation to the impact of the pandemic on investment and trade, the current investment and trade climate is also rather bleak, given the stagnation of several sectors in tandem with reduced investment capacities of foreign investors. FDI is becoming increasingly unlikely in the coming period, and abuses of dominance as such by current incumbent is becoming increasingly likely. Such market structure would render any country an unfavorable investment destination and may lead to further abuses of monopoly powers. For Egypt, for example, the impact on the tourism sector is severe. The tourism income contributes normally to 5% of Egypt GDP. Following the imposition of domestic and international travel restrictions, tourism have been considerably hindered. On a side note, transport restrictions have negatively impacted revenues as well from Suez Canal, given Egypt's position as a large market for importing goods. Also, the inflows of remittance has been severely affected by the crisis. The unemployment that resulted from the crisis has led to a decrease in the remittance coming from Egyptian abroad, which significantly also contributed normally to Egypt's GDP. In this environment, ECA was keen to take into account all these challenges in developing its enforcement, but also its competition policy in the upcoming period. The implementation of competition law in time of crisis is imperative given the market cleaning or the exit of smaller firms with lower wealth of capital and financial resources. ECA has considerably adapted their enforcement strategies and offered support to market players in several sectors. We played a very careful role when assessing potential infringements in light of supply chain obstructions and importation restrictions, and closely monitors any substantial or rapid price changes in the market, especially within priority sectors. We recognize that supply chain have faced considerable disruption due to the outbreak of the coronavirus. The duration and intensity of the associated demand shocks remain unknown, and circumstances have incentivized business cooperation to mitigate the effects of the crisis to the ultimate benefit of consumers. For that reason, ECA enacted an exceptional informal procedures akin to the EU model for parties to obtain ad hoc guidance on specific horizontal cooperation projects as part of ECA's role in spreading competition culture, but also making sure that efficient cooperation, horizontal cooperation are taking place. As a result of importation restrictions that have taken place during the COVID-19 outbreak, utilizing the productive capacities of other firms, for instance, can be objectively justifiable. The market is in a very delicate state at the moment, given the cumulative effect of lower production capacity utilization, mass layoffs, reduced FDI, and the dangers of excessive pricing. ECA has taken a more lenient approach when it comes to efficiency claims, both in this context and with regard to the introduction of a merger control regime, which will be discussed in the coming slides. Now, given possible coordinated theories of harm, ECA is very cautious in its assessment of horizontal cooperation. ECA addresses whether the proposed agreement is objectively necessary to achieve the claimed consumer benefits that is linked to the duration of the associated demand shock and does not extend beyond the objectives of overcoming the challenges posed by the pandemic, and whether any sensitive commercial information or cost and pricing information would be exchanged unless they are imperative for the success of the cooperation in question. Also, we'll ask the question if the cooperation would have an anti-competitive effect, such as imposing limitation on production in some way or facilitate collusion on the relevant market. In short, what we wanted to ensure is that we will only allow pro-competitive cooperation while also making sure that companies does not take advantage of the current situation to impose or to try to implement non-necessary cooperation that could have a lasting anti-competitive effect. As an example, one of the projects that ECA has advised upon was a joint production agreement. The joint production would, ECA find out actually that the joint production would allow the companies to generate quantitative efficiency, and that the agreement may lead to increased production capacity utilization, retention, and lower production costs, which in turn are likely to be passed on to consumer in form of lower prices and availability of adequate quantities of the product market on the marketplace. But this is not everything. ECA has been for so long vocal about the shortcoming in the Egyptian competition regime. And we have been very vocal with our government about the need to alter the current competition framework to make it more conducive, not just of competition, but innovation and other economic efficiencies. And for that reasons, ECA believes that in a time of crisis, a merger control is a must to overcome the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic may pose to our economy. And for this reason, I will ask my colleague Farah here to introduce what is the changes that will be presented to the government in the running months and hopefully would be adopted into a law very, very soon.
Thank you, Dr. Amir. So far we've identified many of the implications of the crisis. There has been considerable disruption of trade and transport, decreased revenues in key sectors such as tourism. There have been significant disruptions in production cycles and a halt in investment projects that have resulted in weak investor confidence levels. So moving forward, ECA has undertaken to address several key factors to encourage parties' early engagement and discussion with authorities in the current circumstances and beyond. Given that capital flight has become increasingly evident, not only with regards to SMEs, but also multinationals, and has added to their respective debt burdens, ECA in the short term has undertaken to considerably enhance its law and introduce an ex-ante merger control regime. So this is one of our priority projects at the moment, and as Egypt has been undergoing a major economic reform in cooperation with the International Monetary Fund, the proposed reform program has resulted in significant changes in Egypt's economic landscape, which has been reflected in Egypt's economic growth rate. So the merger control regime's main objectives are to create clarity, transparency in merger notification proceedings, make it obligatory to notify prior to the consummation of a merger, which in turn would reduce lethargic bureaucracy and make the system more unhindered by political influence. So within this context, as many of the speakers today have mentioned, are the careful assessments of failing firm defenses in light of the pandemic. So in times of major crisis, they're often discussed, and due to the pandemic, the potential failure of small businesses is very likely. However, competition authorities generally have very rigid criteria. So the Egyptian Competition Authority has undertaken to assess them with a lower standard of proof for the parties. So in the aftermath of the pandemic and following the law amendments, we shall undertake to give consideration to firms in financial difficulty that fall slightly short of failing firm defense criteria until the market can effectively recover. Within this context, also, ECA has introduced a public interest provision in the law to ultimately safeguard the economic interests of the state, public order, and national security. And given the adverse effects of the pandemic and the pressure to clear certain mergers, this is a particularly relevant factor in assessing anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions. ECA will undertake to evaluate dynamic efficiencies and reflect upon supply chain considerations, but with policy objectives and careful consideration to avoid long-term costs for short-term benefits. So we also have a foreign takeover provision, which involves lower thresholds. It's an exemption from the normal thresholds, which in the appraisal involves a substantive test where ECA assesses the public interest considerations of the concentration and whether it constitutes a significant impediment to competition. As Dr. Amir mentioned, horizontal cooperation has become increasingly likely, and given possible coordinated theories of harm, our assessment must be very diligent and with higher scrutiny. So we continue to monitor horizontal cooperation agreements and offer guidance to proposed agreements submitted by the parties in order to increase production capacity utilization, labor retention, and the quantity supplied of certain goods on the market. Collaboration also in terms of research and development programs during this time, especially in the medical field, in the field of medical research, is increasingly likely, and ECA undertakes to evaluate them with heavy scrutiny. This is because cooperation between competitors in current times might increase consumer welfare by making more products available. And most competition laws in the MENA region as well allow for competitor cooperation where there are efficiencies and consumer benefits. So within this context as a whole, we need to strike a balance between under and over enforcement. It's necessary to ensure that actors do not abuse their position and undermine the competitive process, because if anything is evident in current times is that there is a high risk of increased market concentration. We must also keep in mind actualizing the sustainable development goals during this process. Insofar as our developing economies are concerned in the MENA region, the overarching reformatory objective should be achieving market plurality. Our markets are not yet equipped for the competition authorities to reduce regulation, which has been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 outbreak. We must also revitalize sectors that are no longer competitive. And as such, in drafting its merger control regime, ECA is carefully weighing the benefits and drawbacks of different options of notification criteria. We also recognize the need to strengthen domestic supply chains given the likelihood of foreign takeovers that may endanger competition and divert supply chains. As mentioned, it's become quite evident that Egypt's supply chains are in need of strengthening to avoid shortages resulting from importation restrictions and also to prevent the exit of businesses in priority sectors. So accordingly, there is a pressing need to address potential areas of structural reform as well with other regulatory authorities. So yes, this was just a brief account of ECA's current efforts and relevant considerations in combating the adverse effects of the pandemic on Egypt's competitive environment. I will yield the floor to Dr. Amir.
I think I will conclude by saying that, as Farah just told us, our merger framework that we are proposing is mainly aimed to ensure that the domestic supply chain would be strengthened and that our market won't be adversely affected by international disruption of supply chain. I think, as the pandemic has proven, is that there is an important need to ensure that the supply of certain vital product and essential product to consumer would remain undisturbed in a time of crisis, but also means that competition law and policy should play a greater role in encouraging the emergence of small and medium enterprises. And for that reason, we are dedicating specific provisions to protect our startups from being acquired by larger firms or from being exiting the market on the basis of unjustifiable reasons. And that would be not just included in our public interest test, but as I mentioned, there will be specific provisions in relation to startups. We will also include specific provisions for the healthcare sector. The threshold for notification for the healthcare services would be different from other thresholds, as well as the thresholds for retail, food retail activities would be a different threshold. And we believe that this is something important, and the pandemic only underlined and magnified the importance of maintaining a strongly competitive market in these particular sectors. Finally, ECA finished drafting its public procurement guidelines, and they came in a timely manner because, as Professor Frederic mentioned, it is time where we want to make sure that state coffers do not unnecessarily be burdened by excessive prices that could be charged as a result of a bid rigging or a collusion that take place at a procurement process, and that it is also a time where we need to ensure that our public services are efficiently delivered, which means that our public procurement and bid rigging enforcement should be made clearer to everyone, to the parties and to different government entities, in order to ensure fairness, transparency, and the integrity of the competitive process, as well as to avoid conflict of interest and provide fair treatment for the business community while maintaining the efficient delivery of our public services. This is everything we wanted to share with you today, and thank you for giving us the time to explain how ECA is planning to intervene in the post-COVID-19 era. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabil and Ms. Farah, for your intervention from the Egyptian Competition Authority. We are running a bit late and would like to ask speakers please to kindly consider the time limit in their presentations. I would like now to pose the same question to Mr. Jamal Abu Farha, who is the Director General of the Competition General Directorate in Palestine. Mr. Jamal, what have been the main challenges you have faced in Palestine since the beginning of the crisis, and which measures have you taken to protect and promote competition? You now have the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the UNESCWA and the collaborated organization UNCTAD and OECD for hosting this meeting and for organizing this important meeting, just to keep us in touch in this very unique situation. And let me thank and welcome the audience who are joining this meeting with us today. I try to make a very short presentation about the case of Palestine. I hope I can commit the time. I don't know if you can view my presentation on behalf of me on your screen or not. But anyway, first of all, I would like to give an idea about the Palestinian economy, general idea, brief idea about the Palestinian economy, and then I will go to the competition policy and the challenges.
Mr. Jamal, you have the right if you would like to share your presentation.
No, because I use my mobile phone for the camera, so I have a problem actually.
All right, so we will share. You want us to
no
share?
No problem. I can just speak.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll give an idea about the Palestinian economy, as I mentioned, general idea, brief idea. The population in Palestine around 5 million in 2019, and the GDP around $15 billion in 2019. GDP growth 1.2% in 2017, 0.9% in 2018, and 2.5% in 2019. GDP per capita in West Bank around $2,924 in West Bank and $876 in Gaza Strip. Our economy actually as small as the population and as young as the age of the Palestinian Authority. Since 1994, the Palestinian Authority came to Palestine and started as a government. The Palestinian economy is actually comprised mostly by small and medium enterprises. And around 90 to 95% of our economy is SMEs. That's important to be taken into account while we are making the mergers in our competition draft law, since we don't have competition law yet. And the Palestinian Authority, from its inception, adopted the market economy and the open market policy, and signed a number of free trade agreements with the worldwide countries, such as Europe, United States, Mercosur countries, and Turkey, Arab greatest area, and another countries actually. And what controlling our economic life is the Paris Protocol with Israel, which we signed in 1994 to organize the economy with the Israeli side, and that consider Palestine and Israel as custom union. And that's why our prices in Palestine may be highest prices comparing with the Arab countries in the area. Our economic challenges, for sure, the political situation. The political situation, all of you know that we are not independent state. We are under occupation still. We are suffering more than any country in this world, since we are following the Israeli economy and the Israeli procedures. They are controlling our daily life, controlling our borders, and they are putting impediments to our trade. And our situation is very harsh and complicated, actually. And our economy, as I mentioned, is not independent economy. It is following the Israeli economy. And there is another problem is around the weakness of our legal environment. We are need to develop our laws, our legislations to be compatible with the updates in the economy situation. And so if we have plans and policies for economy, the problem is how to implement these plans while we are living under occupation, as I mentioned before. Every problem connected to the political situation. Now I'm going to the competition policy and legislation. I'll give you a very brief idea. The first draft of competition has been made in 2003. That's since around 17 years old. And actually in 2006, the Legislative Council stopped working since our political crisis between the legal authority in Palestine and Hamas movement who controlling Gaza Strip. That for sure delay the legislation process. Our parliament doesn't work, and we are living the emergency conditions since 2006. In 2000, from 2002 to 2007, we engaged in the Euromid program, which contained a very important topic, which was the competition, and that gave us a good idea about the importance of adopting competition policy and law and push up forward. We made a review for our competition draft law actually the second time in 2010, and we submitted to the Ministerial Council instead of the Parliament because emergency cases, as I mentioned. In 2013, they do not adopt the competition draft law because they need to be reviewed more and more and to improve the draft before adopted. And they created a body, enforcement body, a general directorate for competition within the Ministry of Economy. They want to adopt an independent body for implementing the competition law. We realize the importance of independence of this body, but actually for the lack of financial resources, they adopt a general directorate in the beginning. Maybe in the future we can do a independent body. In 2015 to 2018, we engaged in the regional competition and consumer program for the MENA countries, who aims to achieve the economic integration in the area. Mr. Teresa is here. She was our guide, our organizer in this program, and that program really was cornerstone to push up Palestine to adopt the competition law. Since they are coming to Palestine and make a national seminar in competition law awareness and review our competition draft law in that time, and that support the issue of adopting competition law in Palestine. I would like here to thank UNCTAD for this program. Minister of National Economy in 2016 has formed a national committee to review the competition draft law. It was included around 20 different institutions from the national community. And in 2017, CLDB, the Commercial Law Development Program funded by USA, support us in this review, support the National Committee and review our competition draft law. And we stopped working with them in 2018 for a political situation since Trump policies against the Palestinian and for a favor of Israel. The National Committee for reviewing the draft law finished the work in 2019, in the beginning of 2019, and our Minister of Economy has submitted the new draft to the Ministerial Council to be adopted, and the draft law is passing the first reading and the second reading, and now it is in the third reading. We have to be adopted very soon. Challenges confronting in the corona disease time. Actually, some of our traders, they use this crisis for their personal benefits, and they're trying to raise up prices and monopolizing markets. And our ministry and consumer protection directorate in the Ministry of Economy following these problems actually, and we create a hotline for receiving complaints from the consumers to follow up these problems from consumers. For sure, the quarantine and the health crisis of COVID-19 affected our daily life and our economy, and the closures and the loss of supply and too many economic problems, as well as the other countries in this world. And the government actually has created a special fund to compensate the affected workers, only the labor, the workers who have been affected by these crises. The net international investment balance in Palestine decreased by 16% in 2019, from the beginning of 2019 until now. And the customer deposits in Palestine increased by 8.9% in 2019 also. Generally, IMF, the International Monetary Fund, expect a decline in global GDP by 4.9% in the 2020. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jamal, for sharing the experience of Palestine. In fact, Palestine is one of the few countries in the region that has no effective legislation that regulates competition processes. We hope that Palestine be able to pass its competition law and strategy the soonest to enable it to also establish a competition authority that manages and enforces best practices in the field. Like many other countries also in the region, another challenge remains in the ability to officially pass through a comprehensive overall law on competition that would formally outlaw things like monopolies or dominance practices of businesses, which are very much linked to political factors. It's also important for our countries to formally establish authorities to oversee and manage competition, ensuring that rules and mechanisms are clear, transparent, and accessible to all the people. Thank you very much. I now would like to introduce Mr. Sakr Al-Sakr from the Competition Protection Agency of Kuwait. Mr. Al-Sakr, what have been the main challenges you have faced in Kuwait since the beginning of the pandemic and the crisis, and what measures have you taken to protect and promote competition in Kuwait? The floor is yours for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Natalie. Is my voice clear? Thank you.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar alongside of you, esteemed colleagues. I believe that in an unprecedented time like these, we must support each other and learn from each other. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to benefit from our neighboring countries' experiences in dealing with this significant crisis. Going straight to the point, the first challenge that we faced in Kuwait due to the COVID-19 pandemic is having 90% of our agency employees work remotely. It imposed a great challenge for us, from granting access to authorized employees' personal computers to transforming all of our services on our website instead of having the applicants attend the premises, and also facing glitches on our website due to the overload of complaints and inquiries, and the misconception of the public where they mistaken our jurisdictions with other entity jurisdictions. However, the greater challenge that we faced is when the Council of Ministers announced a full lockdown, and that resulted in the delay of most of our active cases in the agency because we weren't able to conduct sufficient investigations nor interview the parties of the cases. As per mergers and acquisitions, the agency remains open to accept requests on our website. However, most of our cases have requested extensions due to the effects of the pandemic. In addition to the full lockdown, all courts have been closed, so we weren't able to process cases. These have been the most challenging issues that we encountered since the crisis started, and several actions have been taken by the agency to address these challenges, such as 3 task forces were created. The first task force was selected to aid and assist in providing a rapid response to antitrust-related matters via email and hotline. The second task force was created to aid and assist in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry in providing inputs on competition-related matters, such as regulating imports and exports and issuing reports on the agriculture industry, and regulating the essential products to consumers and gathering statistics on platforms and markets that has been affected by the pandemic. The third task force was created to assist on government legislations by offering our expert opinion on competition-related matters. As you're aware, a lot of laws have been made by our government to contain the pandemic. And we, as a competition protection agency, we made sure that we need to give our expert opinion on these laws from a competitive, because we believe that some of these laws might have serious implications on the market and competition. So we created a team of experts that will be in charge of addressing these implications that might arise from these laws. I'll share with you some of the comments that we had on these laws. A permission was given to competing companies in different market sectors to meet under the supervision of the government in order to cover the shortage in essential products and services that has risen from the crisis. As a competition protection agency, we don't mind if these competing companies are going to meet under the banner of research and development, but these companies are going to meet and share sensitive information such as production, cost, capacity, and contracts. We believe that this type of information should be restricted to the government in order to prevent any type of collusions in the future. The other law is exempting certain companies from certain markets that provide essential services and products from closing down during the lockdown and curfew, and allowing them to continue offering their services by delivery. What came with that law is that we noticed an increase of 20 to 30% of prices by these companies, and also obligating the consumers with very high minimum orders to delivery. The agency has set recommendations to relevant government authorities to regulate exemptions with transparency by announcing the operating procedures that must be followed. The third law I'll share with you is the fixation of prices. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we noticed that the pharmaceutical companies, they decided to restrict the flow of the face masks into the market in order to increase the prices. The government intervened and fixed the prices. As a principle in the Competition Protection Authority, we're against the fixation of prices, but under these unusual circumstances, the government had to intervene to manipulate any type of manipulation of prices. The final law I'll share with you is that the government declared that all services would be digitalized, a preventative measure during the pandemic. And from a competitive point of view, we believe that there will be a surge of demand on the software industry by the government sector and the private sector. And we must keep a close eye on the competing companies, because we believe that surge of demand might result in future collusions in the future. As for our reconstructive plans after the pandemic has settled down, the agency has set guidelines and SOPs that would help address the anti-competitive acts with minimal economic damages. We will continue to monitor prices and notify monetary entities regularly to monitor competing companies that were allowed to conduct meetings during the pandemic. And the agency is still equipped to receive mergers and acquisitions requests, while keen on the importance of rapid approvals or rejections due to the effects that the companies faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll leave the floor for the next speaker. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabir, for sharing the experience of Kuwait. I would like now to pass the floor to our last but not least speaker of our second panel, Ms. Fathiya Hamid, who is the second Vice President of the Tunisian Competition Council. Ms. Hamid, what have been the main challenges you have faced in Tunisia since the beginning of the crisis? And can you explain the measures you've taken to protect and promote competition? You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me please thank all the organizers of this webinar for this wonderful opportunity you gave us to exchange and to learn from each other. So for Tunisia, March the 2nd was the first case officially declared of COVID-19. And then the total lockdown was decreed 20 days later. And after that period, the Tunisian government began to ease the health and social measures of the total shutdown by following a gradual and oriented deconfinement protocol in order to revive the economy and to save some sensitive sectors. Generally, we can notice a careful satisfaction of the public opinion towards the public authority health management policy during the period of crisis. In fact, the results were that the country had been succeeded to master the health situation until declaring from May to July no COVID cases inside Tunisia. That means that all the new COVID cases were coming from foreign countries. So why is it important to talk about it? It's important because it's the result of a global strategy in our country established gradually during the crisis. All citizens and institutions were asked to apply the new implemented tough procedures. They all have shown sufficient willingness to react on time and to follow the public authorities' instructions. So the key words were trust in public authorities and flexible, efficient communication policy. So the Tunisian Competition Council took part of that national effort. In fact, it has responded to this health crisis by listening to the economic players and consumers in order to determine the priorities that were first to ensure the continuity of first need goods supply and the health care services. The second priority was to guarantee the protection of the consumer welfare. So even though it was forced to slow down its working pace because of the total lockdown, our authority, the Tunisian Competition Authority, has been stood active and vigilant. A part of its staff continued working in order to maintain minimum service level. In fact, the brutal market disruption caused by the pandemic has led to difficulties in the production and distribution of a number of essential products like flour, pasta, detergent, medical equipment, etc., which has in some cases led to shortages either because of the substantial increase of demand versus the insufficient production because of some factories were unable to open, or also because
Ms. Fathia, I think you were cut. Ms. Fathia, we cannot hear you.
monopolistic practices or predatory acts to control prices over high demand items. Moreover, the Tunisian antitrust legal framework has been strengthened during that crisis. In fact, we were asked as a Tunisian council, we have been earlier suggested more heavy sanction on producers, users, and retailers engaged in excessive pricing of first need goods and health related products. And here I join Mr. Frederick Jenny that when he said that an abuse of dominance can lead to an abuse of pricing. So moreover, the Tunisian antitrust legal framework has been strengthened. In fact, the Tunisian Council has early suggested more heavy sanctions on producers and the retailers engaged in excessive pricing of first need goods and health-related products. Besides, in order to preserve litigants' rights, the Tunisian Council decided to suspend since March 22nd all the various legal and procedural deadlines, such as the merger control deadline, the legal deadline given to defendants for responding to a petition against them, and the legal deadline for 2 months to respond to final research conclusion reports. So after the COVID-19 lockdown period, the biggest challenges was how to enhance the enforcement of the competition law in order to overcome the post-COVID market difficulties. That question is crucial for the government that has shown more interest to the importance of the mission of the Tunisian Competition Council. For example, in Tunisia, the prime president, the prime minister talked twice in his speeches last month about the Tunisian Council and the importance of his role in the economy. In fact, the Council could have an active role in the coming period. There is a wide unanimity in the Council that a strict enforcement in the domestic markets after the COVID-19 lockdown period will be necessary to compensate for the potential loss of foreign competition caused by COVID, which may cause additional corporate demands for the protectionism, for more protectionism, which is a threat for the competition. So, besides, the Council is planning to review if full or partial relaxation of the competition rules may have adverse effects on industries, business, and consumers by resulting in anti-competitive practices such as price fixing, excessive pricing, collusion between competitors, and public subsidies. Then a specific scrutiny dealing with excessive raise of many product prices on, especially on online platforms, on which purchase volume has been highly increased during the lockdown, should be carried out by the Council. Finally, it is clear that COVID-19 pandemic is worldwide and new at the same time. So we think that this challenging crisis creates a great opportunity for competition authorities around the world to share their best practices to face similar challenges. So that's why we are convinced as an authority, we are aware of the importance of the international exchange and cooperation with different authorities all over the world. The lessons learned through the best practices from international exchange remains an efficient means Council to develop its role in such circumstances. So I was concise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing the experience of Tunisia, Ms. Fathia Hamid from the Tunisian Competition Council. Let us now move with our third and last panel for today. We will hear from our esteemed experts from the OECD, UNCTAD, and UNESCWA. Unfortunately, our speaker from the League of Arab States will not be able to join us today because of a health emergency. We wish Dr. Bahjat Abu Nasser a swift recovery. So in light of the global pandemic, many competition authorities around the world have resorted to regional and international cooperation and increased their efforts to launch joint initiatives. Regional and international cooperation plays a major role in countries' recovery in times of crisis. Cooperation and information sharing between competition authorities is now needed more than ever to facilitate the response and increase the resilience to the pandemic. I would like to ask my colleague, Mr. Khalid Al-Muallim, the Economic Affairs Officer at UNESCWA, what is the role of regional and international cooperation in this context, and how can regional and international organizations support competition authorities in adjusting to the new challenges? Please, Khalid, you have 10 minutes to elaborate on these two questions. Khalid, we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you still, Khalid.
About now? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, great. So I'm going to share my my PowerPoint. Can you see it?
Yes, yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, and good afternoon for folks in our part of the world, and good morning for others. Today I'm going to speak about the role of regional cooperation in supporting competition authorities in adjusting to the new challenges, mainly COVID-19. So basically, I just wanted to give you some background about what we do here at UNESCWA, or what we do in our cluster. So I work for the Shared Economic Prosperity Cluster, and focusing on trade and connectivity. And the perspectives that I'm going to provide today is on the specific role that that regional organizations such as UNESCWA and others in the region can provide to the countries of the region. And hopefully that provides that provokes some reactions and discussions on all of our parts. So UNESCWA has been working on in regional cooperation in the Arab region, basically in fostering regional and sub-regional economic integration and advocating for the regional implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. We've been contributing to bridging economic, social, and environmental gaps among member states and sub-regions, and we've been promoting multilateral dialogue, regional knowledge sharing, and networking. And we've been promoting intra and inter-regional cooperation, both among member states and through collaboration with other regional organizations. And the reason I mention these points is just to show you that many of these points, or all of these points, can be applied also while trying to find a regional response to the economic devastation that the COVID-19 pandemic has produced. And so just to run a few lines on the impact of COVID-19 on the region's economies. So the pandemic is expected to increase the number of extreme poor in 14 countries in the region by 9.1 million. And the total number of poor in the 14 countries will be 160 million in 2021, where over 80% reside in 4 countries, namely Egypt, Yemen, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Sudan. The losses in gross domestic product and GDP and wealth in excess of 500 billion in 2020. And of course, the losses of more than equivalent of 6 million full-time jobs in 2020 due to the losses in working hours. And here I want to just stop at the last point, and just to show that basically, as we're talking about competition and as we're talking about creating conducive market environments for the players in the market, this is the context we're living within in the region because of COVID-19. Poverty has risen. Consumers are finding themselves trapped and basically cornered by producers, and even producers are having trouble with their supply chain. So, but the idea is that this is the bottom line impact of the pandemic on poverty, and that of course has has a huge impact on the economies. And so, if we look at fostering the competition in the Arab world to help combat this pandemic, we're currently implementing the ongoing agreement with OECD and UNCTAD, an ongoing project. And here I want to stop and refer to the colleague from UNCTAD who was talking about the overseeing of the implementation of the UN set of multilaterally agreed equitable principles and rules for the control of restricted business practices and its 40-year anniversary. And we believe at UNESCWA that while we advocate and while we work with member countries to sort of implement these policies, it's also very important to synchronize and look at how these countries perform in terms of implementing these agreements. Also, we have a strategic position in promoting a regional enabling environment, business environment. So many countries in the region already have antitrust laws, already have competition laws, already have anti-collusion laws. Institutions, I mean, we heard from 4 institutions today and facilities. So I believe that the role of international organizations is to strengthen these already existing mechanisms or already existing tools. And if they're not there, maybe we can provide and support in looking at best practices around the world, around the region, and seeing how the issue of competition can be best addressed in our member countries, particularly while we are at the backdrop of COVID-19. And of course, advocating for synchronized regional competition frameworks is important. Also, if I'm going to speak from a trade perspective or a trade and connectivity perspective, so the idea that different countries don't in the region don't collaborate on making sure that these are synchronized, these competition frameworks are synchronized, this will halt regional trade, regional integration, and hence this will affect regional economies and also national economies. Of course, the monitoring, the implementation, enforcement of regional and sub-regional and bilateral trade agreements. And here I mentioning trade agreements, and I will speak in a little bit a bit after this slide about how we can do this and how this can help with enhancing the situation of competition in the economies of the region. Many of those regional, sub-regional, and bilateral trade agreements, to be frank, are not enforced or not implemented. And so here at UNESCWA we monitor and we see the performance of these trade agreements, and also to what scale or scope these are affecting the national and regional economies. And lastly, I want to talk about the mapping and upscaling of efforts here, livelihoods generation. So as you can see in my previous slide, I was talking about the 6 million jobs lost because of COVID-19. And I think as regional organizations, and while we promote integration and within the multilateral system, it's a reality that the loss of livelihoods is a transboundary issue. And most of the migration, most of the adverse effects of this is it needs to be addressed. And so here I want to just take this opportunity to just give a small promotion of something that we're doing here at the Trade and Connectivity subcluster at UNESCWA. So we're going to be piloting something called the Arab Trade Facilitation Gateway. And here, this is just a snapshot of an under construction sort of online tool that we're building. And here we want to address market access, economic integration performance, supporting trade negotiations, and accompanying policies. And of course, we're looking at this from the standpoint that if we provide information, particularly to traders, particularly people who produce and trade and export, if we provide that information, we can help lay better the landscape and make it a bit more fair, especially for small-time producers and especially for small-time exporters. And basically, when it comes to market access, here we're looking at the barriers, and not just in terms of the trade barriers, but also the competition barriers. I mean, if a trader wants to enter a particular market, what are the competition barriers, and are there any mechanisms to protect any investments undertaken by that exporter? I don't want to take so much time, but I just want to also highlight that. We have to work with an urgency in this region. Here in Lebanon, the economy is on the verge of collapse. Also in neighboring countries, yes, COVID-19 had a lot of impact and a lot of effects on this, but it's basically structural problems. It's structural issues that are impeding a response to this, and also affecting the resilience of people in terms of living within this pandemic. And we don't know yet information about this pandemic and how much it will affect our future lives. But I think it's high time for us as regional organizations to bring together best practices, to bring together also countries who can benefit from enhancing competition in their own economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalid. If I may add a little bit on your intervention, giving some examples of ESCWA's immediate reaction to the pandemic to support its member countries. For example, one of the things that ESCWA did was call for to form a social solidarity fund, which supports vulnerable countries, including the Arab least developed countries, and provide relief during health emergencies or food shortages. Also, Arab governments were called to remove all barriers on imports and exports, mainly on food, medical products, and inputs from industries producing essential goods. ESCWA also invited the Arab central banks to enhance liquidity and encourage lending and investment, and to adopt necessary measures to uplift the burdens on small and medium enterprises. As Khalid also mentioned, ESCWA made an initial assessment of the economic cost in the Arab region of the crisis and the implications on many socioeconomic factors like poverty, women, employment, immigrants, fiscal costs, and so forth, to help member countries design appropriate region and national recovery and response plans. Thank you very much. I now pass the same question to Mr. Juan Luis Crisilgi, Chief of Capacity Building and Advisory Services of the Competition and Consumer Policies Branch at UNCTAD. Juan Luis, please, you now have the floor for 10 minutes.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you very much, Natalie. Good morning to the representative of the international organizations that lead this project, namely ESCWA, OECD, and UNCTAD, to the representative of the member states of the region, and to all the listeners of this event. I would like to thank of ESCWA, Lynn Robertson of OECD, and my director, Teresa Moreira, for the excellent organization of this event, which I consider very important in these moments of health and economic crisis. This is an example of sharing the knowledge of 3 international organizations that work, among other things, on promoting efficient competition policies around the world. I don't want to repeat all the information that we learned from the previous speakers. I would like only say that the COVID-19 pandemic has raised a wide range of competition issues, problems arising from the health crisis because the increased demand of the basic products, and the economic crisis resulting from the confinement and the lockdown of many economic sectors has led to the closure of many companies due to the inactivity and the lack of the liquidity. The competition authorities have had to take a position on these problems and practice, and have also had to put in place specific measures. The point to be noted here is that those issues are common to the competition authorities all over the world. As the COVID-19 crisis is the global issue common, they are dealing with the similar competition issues and facing the similar challenges. Cooperation among competition authorities in taking with the issues in common together. One of the most useful ways on international cooperation is sharing experiences on the similar competition issues and information on the similar anti-competitive cases, especially for small and young competition authorities. It is beneficial to learn from how other advanced competition authorities have dealt with those issues. Also, enforcement against anti-competitive practices could be carried out more effectively under international and regional cooperation. It would also be necessary for competition authorities to cooperate in the policy area to jointly tackle with the argument for relaxation of competition law enforcement and the movement towards protectionism with which exploit this crisis. In this regard, international organizations such as UNCTAD and OECD can encourage the cooperation among competition authorities by providing a forum for discussion and information exchange. For example, on April 8, UNCTAD published a note titled Defending Competition in the Markets During COVID-19, which refers to some reactions of competition authorities and also includes 5 key recommended actions. The first, ensure equal conditions between companies for a level playing field that remains relevant even in a crisis period. The second, temporarily cooperation arrangements necessary to ensure the supply and distribution of affordable products to all consumers to prevent a shortage of essential products. Third, closely monitor markets of essential products such disinfectants, masks, etc., if necessary, through temporary price caps to protect the health of consumers during the pandemic. Fourth, vigorous competition law against companies that take advantage of the crisis by creating cartels or abusing their market power. And fifth, adapt competition procedure and deadlines to the extraordinary circumstances created by the pandemic. Subsequently, on April 27, UNCTAD published a newsletter, Competition and Consumer Protection During COVID-19 Crisis Initiative formed around the world, which is a compilation of activities by competition authorities to deal with COVID-19. Moreover, UNCTAD organized and participate in events and webinars where competition authorities can discuss, exchange their views and experience, and learn from others. This seminar is an example, but I can mention many other events in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, where we try to generate a debate and an exchange of experience that will serve to address the serious problems of the crisis. We believe that it is very important that the measures adopted serve to get out of the crisis. For this purpose, it is necessary to strengthen competition policy and also to take into account we are in a period of transitions towards the digitalization of the economies and the climate change. To this end, cooperation and regional and international level will be key to the successful recovery of the economies. UNESCWA, OECD, and UNCTAD are convinced that this project, aimed at promoting the principle of competition in the markets of this region, will contribute to establish solid basis for economic recovery and encourage cooperation among member states. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Juan Luis. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our last speaker of the day, Ms. Lynn Robertson. Ms. Lynn is the competition expert and project manager at the OECD Competition Division. Lynn, please, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Natalie. And I'd like to thank UNESCWA. I'd like to thank UNCTAD for working together as we organize this webinar. I certainly hope it's the first of many in the Arab region, both during this COVID period, but also post-COVID. I'd like to share with you my content. So let me see how to do it. I'd also like to welcome the participants. There we go. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and welcome the participants. What I'm going to talk to you about is cooperation between agencies, between authorities of different jurisdictions. Cooperation could also be between different regulators within the same jurisdiction, but in this case, I'm going to focus on cooperation between jurisdictions, specifically through competition authorities. What we're looking at is globalization, and there's a growing number of multi-jurisdictional cases emphasizes the need for cooperation and coordination. We now have over 120 countries that have competition laws and an effective competition authority. And the fact we now are at 120 gives an added impetus for the importance of cooperation. We know that competition authorities increasingly face situations where effective enforcement of competition laws does depend on cooperation with other competition authorities in other jurisdictions. International and regional cooperation can extend from both informal cooperation, this picking up the telephone to ask an opinion, to much more formal cooperation. And the benefits of cooperation include extending limited budgets. Even if cooperation may be resource intensive upfront, we do know that in the long run, it can bring efficiencies. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm just a bit, yes, I'm just a bit worried because my Wi-Fi keeps dropping. So we also know that through cooperation, we can develop personal relations of trust. And this trust is particularly important during delicate periods of investigations and during proceedings. Cooperation brings training opportunities to build internal capacities and structures. We can see peer learning, peer review of new guidelines, and then communicate on remedies so that they do not harm other jurisdictions. The OECD on international cooperation is anchored in a recommendation. We carried out a survey in 2013 with the International Competition Network, which showed that there was significant cooperation undertaken, but there were existing legal and practical limitations that often made cooperation very burdensome and limited its scope. We know that countries, the OECD members, but also OECD non-members that adhere to this recommendation see it as an essential instrument to help foster enforcement, and they often use it as a template to establish agreements with other authorities and other countries. So in order to coordinate on investigations and proceedings, provide assistance, where in some case a witness may not be in one jurisdiction, but maybe in another, we can call in another authority to undertake a witness together, the witness statement. On exchange of information, including confidential information, as well as more general assistance and cooperation. Now we're facing this COVID-19, and as a result of COVID-19, we're seeing closed borders, we're seeing increasing calls for more state interference. We see a loosening of competition rules, a revival of national regional champions, and unseen challenges for the organization of agencies in their enforcement, and many are inhibited due to measures to contain COVID-19. This is restricting the way that authorities normally would operate on a day-to-day basis. And as my colleague from Kuwait pointed out, authorities are turning to each other to learn and to support each other on how to deal with these challenges and what temporary solutions could be implemented. I'd like to discuss with you and share with you what the OECD is doing to help foster cooperation, help to foster the exchange between different authorities. And I'd like to provide this information to you in the optic of what could be done for the MENA region as well. So perhaps taking these as a template for further webinars within the MENA region. The countries that have participated in our webinars have found them to be extremely useful. We've facilitated this exchange between authorities as we are a neutral platform. We don't have any particular vested interest in the direction or the decisions that the different authorities make. Our interest is to connect authorities together so that they can learn from each other, and we can create a convergence on competition law and policy, both internationally and regionally, which, as my colleague from UNESCWA says, is convergence can help encourage better trade and better integration of economies across a region. We currently have 3 formal centers. We have one in Seoul, Korea, we have Budapest, and our latest edition is in Lima, Peru. We hope one day, working with UNESCWA, UNCTAD, to see if we can somehow create more of a capacity building mechanism for the MENA region. What the Korea Policy Center has offered towards the countries, for the countries of Asia and Southeast Asia, they have a virtual seminar on the health sector towards the end of July, actually this week. And then also they've organized a meeting of high-level representatives of the Asia Pacific competition authorities, which took place just recently, just this week as well. Budapest, a set of competition policies, responses to the crisis, and some of the topics that were dealt with, I won't go into all of them, but looked at price gouging, which is something that a number of the authorities who presented here today refer to, and also merger control in the face of uncertainty in the case of state intervention. But again, merger control was one that several of the authorities today referenced to. In Lima, we held a virtual seminar also for the heads of authority. And then competition in the health sector, we saw that Kuwait mentioned issues with the pharma sector. We've had a number of different jurisdictions, particularly highlighting the issues that they're facing to ensure the supply chain is maintained and ensure that there's not price gouging. And so some of the topics, these again are just a few of them: cartel enforcement, healthcare mergers, and again, there's a number of case studies, both from within countries of the region. This peer learning is very important. We see this today as we've had Egypt, we've had Tunisia, we've had Kuwait, we've had Palestine. But also in the case of when we looked at healthcare mergers, we brought in expertise from outside of Latin America, in terms of France, FTC, UK. And again, there's learning to be had within a region, but it's good to bring in the fresh knowledge as well from possibly older, more experienced agencies. Well, I've focused on what the OECD is offering. We do see the International Cooperation Network has issued a statement too, reaffirming the importance of competition, and the European Competition Network. Frédéric earlier mentioned what the statements of the EC, and here again it mentions, in this particular statement, mentions that there's a recognition that there needs to be some sort of a softening perhaps of the way enforcement takes place, but at the same time European authorities are still vigilant and active in their level of enforcement. So the concept of a joint statement, it sends a measure, it does send an important message to the private sector, as well as other parts of government, that because of COVID-19, this is not a reason to increase anti-competitive activities. It's not a reason to think that there would be less enforcement, but there's a recognition that conditions are exceptional, but they are finite as well, that this is not particular conditions that will continue. So just to wrap up, I'm cognizant of time, so I've gone rather quickly. Our slides will be available. We recognize that much as we have a long history of the OECD of cooperation, we have over 60 years of it. COVID-19, as Mr. Munir Tabat said, there's a flip side. It also provides opportunities in a crisis. And the opportunity here is to really recognize the importance of cooperation, which should extend beyond the COVID-19 period. And what we are happy to see is that authorities are looking to each other. We are seeing more connection, and I would encourage that more within the Gulf region and the MENA region. The OECD and the ICN, we recently undertook a survey, a new survey. I referenced one in 2013, which our recommendation is anchored in. Now we're undertaking a new survey with ICN, and the results will be available very shortly. We'll use the results to look at our recommendation to see if it's still current, to see whether or not we need to adapt it. We that it still remains a gold standard. Create cooperation agreements amongst each other, And we want to see whether or not we can adapt somewhat to ensure that it stays current. We'll continue our global outreach work. We believe that the most promising is closer regional networks because there is a sharing of language, a sharing of culture. There is an economic imperative for regional cooperation. And so we like to focus very much on this regional cooperation initiatives. And of course, the OECD, it's our pleasure, it's our joy, and our responsibility also, we feel, to continue working with UNESCWA and UNCTAD to help build and foster regional cooperation across the MENA region, and I look forward to continuing to do so. We've done quite a bit of work to date already on COVID-19 and the implications for competition. And these notes are available online on the OECD website. Thank you very much. Oh my God.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for your insightful intervention. I would like now to thank all our speakers for their invaluable contributions. In the end, we have some final remarks. I will start from my end, maybe talk very, very quickly about the collaboration UNESCWA is having with OECD and UNCTAD. We have a joint initiative for improving competition in the Arab region, centered on providing advocacy, technical assistance and capacity building, and also to facilitate the sharing of information between competition authorities and strengthening the enforcement of competition policies. In January 2020, the first joint competition forum for Arab countries was convened at UNESCWA in Beirut, which became a very important yearly milestone and created a platform for engaging where participants from the Arab region and around the world, very much like today's event, shared their expertise, learned from best practices, and set the path for developing joint projects and initiatives of common interest. We continue our collaboration and joint efforts now when it is mostly needed and in the future in providing support to the Arab region to enrich the operation of competition policies and improve enforcement outcomes. I would like now to pass the floor to our co-hosts from the OECD and UNCTAD and any of our esteemed speakers for final remarks on the main messages we learned today, and then we will conclude with a short question and answer session. Professor Jenny, the floor is yours for maximum 2 minutes, please, if you would like to do any final remarks.
Two comments I would like to make. First of all, I was very interested by the presentation and to see the commonality of questions across all jurisdictions. Two points I want to make. One of them is what is in store for the future. Well, we're going to go through a period characterized by extra capacity in some industries, where the demand has scaled down. We talked about the aviation industry, but there may be others. Lots of bankruptcies, so that's going to lead to a decrease, to an increase in concentration, and therefore reduction in competition. International restrictions of various kinds that we've talked about, whether it's procurement or industrial policy measures, and a lower level of international trade. So we are up against a situation where we are going to have a lowering of competition because of all those indirect effects and long-lasting effects of the COVID crisis. And competition authorities have to think about how they are going to try to maintain the level of competition that existed before in this adverse environment. The second thing is that we are going to go through a period of economic depression. And there is going to be a question of whether competition is as important, more important, or less important in a time of depression as it is in a time of expansion. And I just want to mention on this point, to finish, the fact that there's a controversy in the US at this point between among economists. Some of them have suggested for a long time that the lack of attention to competition has slowed down the recovery after the great 1929 crisis. And others have said no, that government intervention was in fact quite useful to kickstart the US economy very rapidly after the crisis. So this is an issue which is not even settled intellectually. What is the proper balance between industrial policy and subsidies on the one hand, and between competition on the other? So I think that collectively, as competition authorities, we should try to address this issue and think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your comments. Ms. Teresa, the floor is yours also for maximum 2 minutes for final remarks and comments.
Thank you very much, Natalie. My first words are again to thank you, Natalie, and your UNESCWA team and all the UNESCWA colleagues for having organized this. To all the participants that are following us, and of course our partners from the OECD, I think it is very important to continue sharing experiences as the as the impact and the effects of the pandemic evolve, because of course some months have already gone by. I will absolutely agree that we have ahead of us maybe 2.5 years at least of depression and of serious challenges to to markets, to citizens, to consumers, to governments. I would again appeal to all the competition authorities and the competition experts that from the Arab region to remain very active and reach out to your government counterparts, to other public bodies, because this is the time for government intervention, either we like it or not. And it is extremely important that competition law and policy advocated by with the right expertise, with the knowledge of how markets work in your jurisdictions, in your neighbor area, are fully taken into account. And I would like just to add that UNCTAD is one of the UN agencies actually working in a UN COVID response project, which is led by UNESCWA, other colleagues of Natalie and her team, on how to, what was the impact and how to promote the recovery of SMEs. And our team in UNCTAD is providing the approach from the angle of competition law and policy. So this is here a very clear example on how competition law and policy needs to be taken into consideration, and how competition authorities need to provide inputs and to intervene in the drafting and follow up the implementation of all the measures that will be undertaken to provide for economic recovery. Hope to see you very soon in other webinars. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I would like, although the time is very short, to conclude with addressing only a couple of questions received from our participants. We apologize if we cannot answer all your questions sent through the registration or the YouTube comments. However, we will get back to you by email with an answer from our experts as soon as possible. One of the questions we received about the priorities of the political agenda in the region post-COVID and the linkages to competition policy and its deployment in the short run. Please allow me to address a few points in relation to this very important question, and that our experts may comment. I think the most important part in the short run and when the crisis is emerging is making sure that competition policy is taken into consideration in countries' response plans, including financial recovery plans, or what we call as the stimulus packages. Another methodology which we promote as a regional commission probably would be done more at the longer term is to formulate a comprehensive strategic vision with clear indicators and steps outlined publicly to align the legal framework and implementation of competition policy with developmental agenda. So one of these channels is ensuring that competition policy is integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs can be a window for countries to enhance the recovery progress by providing clear and coordinated approach for building back societies. In a study also that UNESCWA is currently working to assess the business environment legislative framework in the region, we found a lot of weaknesses and gaps in competition legislations with varying degrees between sub-regions. Many countries have basic competition laws with no implementation decrees, while others lack any legislative frameworks related to competition. There's even more gaps found in relative legislations like antitrust, anti-dominance, monopolization, so forth. We also found that when there are laws, there are gaps in enforcement practices, and many countries do not outline even the institutions and the responsibilities. For those countries who do have generally strong competitive enforcement legislations and institutions on paper, yet liberalization of regulated sectors like natural resources, public entities, military and security is not a common practice. So illustrating the difference between legislation and enforcement, some of our main recommendations would be the need to improve and strengthen implementation and enforcement mechanisms, to push for enhanced public awareness and participation in the development, execution, and access to competition laws, and creating regional and sub-regional standardization between bordering countries that could offer more practical and efficient steps for improvement, with knowledge sharing occurring on a sub-regional to sub-regional basis as well. This webinar is one example of a platform for knowledge sharing that we hope to repeat frequently. Our experts, I don't know if you would like to add a couple of points on that. If not, we will move to the second question. Our second question is about the policy of tender or cooperation between companies that in normal condition must compete each other, but during the pandemic, they cooperate. Maybe Teresa, if you can comment on this question quickly, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Natalie. I'm sure Fred Jenny will also like to comment because he's already addressed the issue of public procurement. I think, of course, again, in order to maintain the supply of essential consumer goods and services under exceptional circumstances, a lot of agreements between competitors, namely to provide, well, namely to public procurement procedures, had to be exceptionally authorized. I think what is important is that this coordination really needs to be limited to the strictly necessary and needs to be very closely followed up between competition authorities in coordination with procurement authorities. We did register that in Russia, in the UK, and in Portugal, my home country, so within the EU, at least these three competition authorities adopted concrete guidance, in a way flexibilizing public procurement, the public procurement approach against bid rigging, of course, due to exceptional circumstances, or maybe in some cases due to the essentiality of some goods that needed to be provided. This is what I can say for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. Professor Jenny Lin, would you like to add any final thoughts about these two questions?
The public procurement, what's the other question? The cooperation?
The other question was about the political agenda, the priority on political agendas in relation to competition in the region.
Right. Well, on the agenda, I think that, as I said, we have to think about what is the goal, what is the nature, and what is the prospect for competition law and policy in the coming years, in a time of depression and in a time where there is going to be a strong push for industrial policy. We have to find ways to better coordinate those two policies. On the question of public procurement, I would add the fact that one of the situations which has taken place in many countries is the fact that because of the severity of the crisis, there was just no time to go through the normal procedures of getting competitive bids and then allocating the market. There was an urgent need to find a supplier and then to get the product either to the states or to be distributed to the public. So I think that the guidances which have been published in several countries on emergency procedures in terms of public procurement are extremely useful to try to find the right balance between two things: the urgency of the situation and the need to have as much competition as possible. It is quite clear in all of what's happened during the COVID that competition takes time, and sometimes we don't have the time. Sometimes we need to act more rapidly than this. So we have to have a clear protocol for trying to simplify, accelerate the procedures, in particular in public procurement, at the least possible cost from the point of view of competition. And there are already a number of countries which have published guidelines, as we've heard before. And I would urge all the competition authorities in all the countries, and particularly in the region, to look at those guidelines and to look at those protocols, trying to find the right balance between speed and competition.
Thank you very much, Professor. And sadly, we will need to wrap it up here for today for time reasons. Thank you very much for your time and participation and for bearing with us the extended time. I think we can look back on a very successful webinar with many valuable insights on competition. I would also like to thank our co-hosts from OECD and UNCTAD and all of our esteemed speakers again for their commitment and for sharing their expertise. A big thank you goes to all the participants for showing interest in this very important topic and attending our webinar today and watching. Around 70 plus participants were watching on YouTube. Also, thank you to the hidden soldiers at UNESCWA who supported in the organization of the webinar: Layal, Laura, Bilal, Ruba, and our backstage translator, Ms. Nadine Ayoub. Thank you again. Stay safe, everyone, until we meet again. As-salame.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Bye-bye, everybody.